Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the implementation of the RED III credit mechanism. My name is Gabrielė Šimakauskaitė. I am the Policy Director at ChargeUp Europe. And before we start today's webinar, I would like to shortly introduce you to ChargeUp Europe. So ChargeUp Europe is the voice of the electric vehicle charging industry. With more than 40 members operating more than 700,000 public charging stations across the EU, we represent the full value chain of EV charging in Europe, starting from the hardware manufacturers all the way to the charge point operators, mobility service providers, and other actors within the ecosystem. This is the second webinar that ChargeUp Europe is hosting on the RED credit mechanism. The first webinar that took place back in November 2023 presented the credit scheme and selected cases from credit mechanisms that are already in place in some of the EU countries. Given the high interest in the topic, we decided to create further resources and to also host this webinar. Today, together with experts from our membership, we will walk you through the fundamentals of the credit mechanism and provide recommendations to successfully implement it. The goal of today is to cover the considerations and actions to take into account for an effective setup of and functioning of the national credit mechanism for EV charging. Correct and timely implementation, national implementation is crucial to sustain the private investments in the rollout of the EV charging infrastructure and to also help member states to meet their RED III targets, as well as the EV charging infrastructure deployment targets that are set out in the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation and the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. With us today, we have representatives of ChargeUp Europe members who have contributed extensively with their field experience to the development of the implementation guide, which I will talk about in just a minute. So Moritz Bohland, who is Head of Business Operations at Reev, and Marronnier, Head of Energy at Electra, are going to walk us through the stakeholder mapping and also the market actors that are involved in the RED III credit mechanism, as well as present some key aspects to keep in mind when setting up the credit mechanisms and provide some recommendations on the do's and don'ts. Moritz, if you would like to introduce yourself shortly.
Yeah, thank you, Gabrielė. So again, Moritz Bohland, Head of Business Operations at Reev. Reev is a Munich-based e-mobility company. We're offering software for charging infrastructure for CPOs. We're mainly active in the semi-public area, so for offering software to companies, fleets, large real estate sites, but also for public accessible locations. Specifically, we offer a charge point management system, so a backend solution, as well as software for smart charging applications. And why I'm speaking here today is because we started working with greenhouse gas quotas, which is the German version of e-credits, in the beginning of 2022, after a regulatory change in the German scheme where it became way more interesting to participate in it. And what we did is we integrated these e-credits into our charge point management system. So we gave CPOs the opportunity to gain extra revenue by selling these greenhouse gas quotas. And over the course of the last 2 years, we talked a lot to traders and to companies involved in the market. But we also realized that there is, unfortunately, we experienced that there was a sharp decrease in prices over the course of the last 2 years. So to give you a feeling, when we started in 22, we were able to offer CPOs 15 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity charged at public sites. And meanwhile, this value dropped to 4.5. The market value is actually even lower at 3.3 at the moment, which of course is limiting the incentives to invest into new infrastructure. Overall, we think that it had a good influence on the German market and that some customers were actually really investing more because they thought these additional revenues made the difference. But of course, this is jeopardized by the price decrease. And I can only start with saying that I encourage other countries which have not implemented the mechanism yet to also implement mechanisms that try to keep the price in a certain price band in order to have ongoing investment incentives for the CPOs.
Thank you, Moritz. And Arthur?
Hi everyone, Arthur Marronnier, Head of Energy at Electra. Electra is one of the leading fast charging networks in Europe. We're present in 9 countries in Europe now. We were founded 3 years ago in France and have more than 300 stations today and plan for more than 1,000 in the next coming years. We are specialized in public charging, mostly fast charging. We have a few slow chargers too. We are also extending our business to B2B and depot charging in general. Because of our experience in France and Belgium mostly, but also our recent extension to Austria and the Netherlands and Germany as well, we are directly facing different e-credit mechanism benefiting from these subsidies, and we're gaining experience with the variety of schemes that member states can develop within the general scope that the European Commission, the European institutions set up. We think that today we are at basically a moment where CapEx subsidies are basically being lowered by member states. And so e-credits, which really act as an OPEX subsidy, really act on the electricity price, are a very good way to continue boosting e-mobility, boosting investments in charging networks in general, provided that member states design it properly. And I think that's why it's very important that ChargeUp Europe published this guide that we're going to be discussed today. And very important to stress what the key elements of the scheme will have in terms of impact on the final price for customers.
Thank you very much to both of you for your introductions. One last housekeeping rule. So to make sure that you have all of your questions answered, please do not hesitate to submit them through the Q&A button, which you will find just at the top of your screen. And we will take the questions at the end of the webinar. Before diving into the webinar, I wanted to let you know that ChargeUp Europe has put together a detailed and comprehensive guidance for implementation for national authorities. So this guide is available in all 23 EU languages on our website. You can also access it by scanning the QR code that you see on the slide. To develop the guide, as I already said, we tapped into the experience of our members with the existing national credit mechanisms, such as, for example, Reev and Electra that we have on call today. We are certain that this information will be especially useful to the national authorities that are unfamiliar with the practicalities of setting up and operating the mechanism, as they will have to implement it by the end of May of 2025, so already in less than a year. So to get the webinar started, we would like to shortly introduce the requirements of the RED III directive and to walk you through the relevant provisions. So according to the Renewable Energy Directive, in 2030, the EU must satisfy its final energy consumption via renewable energy. Member states must contribute to this goal collectively. RED III has also set a sub-target for the transport sector. So the Article 25 of RED says that governments must introduce an obligation for fuel suppliers to deliver a quantity of renewable energy to the transport sector so that either the share of the renewable energy consumed in transport is at least 29% by 2030, or the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of the energy delivered to the transport is reduced by 14.5% by 2030. A novelty, the RED III introduces the obligation to set up a credit mechanism, which would allow fossil fuel suppliers to exchange the credits for supplying renewable energy to the transport sector. The suppliers can thus comply either by delivering this renewable energy to transport or by surrendering credits. In this marketplace, charge point operators who provide the electricity to electric vehicles through their charging activities will generate and sell credits to, for example, fuel suppliers. Each member state must set up its own credit mechanism, because the aim of the mechanism is to decarbonize the transport sector of that member state, which means that credits cannot be traded across the borders. As I already mentioned, the transposition deadline for RED III is the end of May of 2025. And so the EU governments in the meantime, or the governments of the member states of the EU, have the flexibility to decide how to set up the obligation on the fossil fuel suppliers to deliver the renewable energy to the transport sector, and also on the settings of the credit mechanism. It is crucial that member states promptly implement the credit mechanism, and that they also do so by learning from the already existing credit mechanisms. This way, the mechanism can be implemented in an efficient and timely manner. It is very important to set a clear legal definition from the very beginning, and to also clearly identify the objective that the credit mechanism should achieve. Finally, to ensure buy-in, it is a good practice to consult stakeholders during the setup of the mechanism. Now, why does this matter? So the EV charging sector has been deploying infrastructure ahead of demand since its inception. With the growing number of the electric vehicles on the EU's roads, the infrastructure deployment will not slow down, and that requires, of course, large upfront private capital investments. However, the speed of the deployment can only be kept up with investments from both private and public sectors alike. A successfully set up credit mechanism will create an added revenue stream for charge point operators, which they can then invest in the rollout of the charging infrastructure. The RED III credit mechanism is a smart way to achieve that, because it simply improves the economics of public EV charging infrastructure, given, of course, that it is set up in the right way. Keeping all of this in mind, we are now going to discuss more in detail the credit mechanism and the key to-dos for its setup. So a number of stakeholders are, of course, involved in the functioning of the credit mechanism. It is very important that there are clearly defined roles and responsibilities, because that will simply lead to an effectively set up and functioning credit mechanism for EV charging. So I will now hand over to our speakers, who will discuss the different actors that are involved in the functioning of the credit mechanism.
Thank you, Gabrielė. First of all, I want to stress that this is an exemplary overview. So all these market actors are usually involved in the mechanism, but it's not necessarily a one-to-one translation in each country. For example, I know that the German mechanism slightly differs from this, and then we have Netherlands, France, and so on, and there will be nuances and tastes, but the overall stakeholders and how they interact should pretty much fit here. I would briefly touch upon the member states, because they are the ones who need to decide in the end how the mechanism should look like. And they're then the one who need to set up the regulation. Starting with the actual implementation, or starting with how it actually works, I would go to the lower right corner to the customers, because this is where the e-credits are generated. Why are e-credits generated? Because we bring renewables to the transport sector, either renewables or we decrease the emission intensity in the transport sector. Those are the two options how this mechanism would work, and both are starting with someone charging at a charge point. So the electricity is going into the car and later on then used for transport purposes. So of course we need the customers. It's not important who the customers are. It might be private users, might be companies, irrespective. So they are not the centerpiece, but of course we're relying on them, because without them charging, there will not be any e-credits. Then the customer is charging in the end. Then where is it charging? It's charging at a charge point. So someone needs to operate that charge point, and that's the CPO, so the charge point operator. And this is what we mainly refer to when we talk about economic operators. So RED III is not specifically defining what economic operators are, but in most member states, those are defined as the CPOs. Those are the ones who are in charge of the charging infrastructure. They're usually making sure that there is electricity. They are usually using the backend. They have all the information. because the information is the most crucial point here, because we cannot allow double accounting. So we need this one-to-one match. So each kilowatt hour that is charged can only be accounted once, and the CPO is the right person to do that. Of course, there is still the chance to have fraud, or there is at least the risk to have fraud, and therefore there are independent agencies or entities, the verifiers in the upper right corner. Those are either private companies who are doing verification to make sure that all the quantities which are generated by the CPO are legit quantities. It can also be public authorities. In Germany, for example, it's the environmental agency who is checking these credits and who's making sure that all of this is going according to legal restrictions. So this is the start. So the economic operators, the CPOs, they are the ones who are usually benefiting from the e-credits, and they are the ones who can then later on trade these e-credits. And this is where I would hand over to you, Arthur.
Thank you, Moritz. So before or after the quantity of electricity or basically the meters of the charge points have been verified, it depends on the country. Sometimes the verification is after, sometimes it's before. The CPO or the economic operator is able to actually register these quantities of electricity on a national registry, usually a website, and we advocate in the guide for something as much digitalized as possible. This is, of course, making it easier for everyone. So you have this registry where, depending on the scheme, the electricity is uploaded either on a regular basis. We advocate for a monthly basis. We'll come back to this later. Or in some countries like Austria, it sometimes is only uploaded once a year, which makes the market usually a little less liquid. So on this registry, you can certificate amounts of energy, but you can also register the trades that you will that the economic operator will do, and these trades, this trading basically in general can be done either directly between economic operators, and mostly CPOs, and fossil fuel suppliers, the obligated parties. So you can have an over-the-counter bilateral deal. So both parties will just agree on a price and a quantity of energy for the certificates. Or economic operators can go through brokers, which will serve as intermediate parties between the fossil fuel suppliers and the CPOs, or directly to traders, which will buy the certificates and then later on sell it to fossil fuel suppliers. So once the deal is made and the parties agree on a price and a quantity, this needs to be registered, usually directly by the economic operator on the registry, to actually transfer from the account of the economic operator to the account of the fossil fuel suppliers and obligated parties, directly on the registry. So it is very important that the registry functions well and is as much digitalized as possible, as I said, so that really deals can be made pretty fast. The market can be pretty agile and react to any external conditions that might be happening in general on the market of biofuels or other external markets that have impact on the scheme.
Thank you both for this helpful overview. So indeed, as said, the setup that you were just seeing on the slide, if we could go back. So the setup is indeed not necessarily how it is now done in the already existing credit mechanisms, or like to like on how it should be done in each member state, but these are the roles that should be considered when setting up the credit mechanism to make it the most efficient for each of the markets in the EU. We're not going to move to our recommendations and some key features that we have distinguished in our guide. that we would like to highlight also here today. So there are several elements that must be considered carefully when setting up the credit mechanism. In the guide that I mentioned earlier, you will find a detailed analysis and also a long list of recommendations that should be taken into account when setting up the credit mechanism. Today we will focus on some of the key elements as first considerations. So starting off with you, Moritz.
Yeah, thank you. So here we want to focus on 2 points. The first is, what is the scope of the mechanism, of the implementation of the mechanism? And the second one is the ambition level. I'll briefly touch upon the scope and then transition to the ambition level. So the scope means what is actually covered by the e-credits, because RED 3 is only mandating to have a system for public charging, but there are member states, namely Germany and Austria, which are also including private charging. So charging at home, charging in the semi-public area as well, because if it's not clearly public, it's usually semi-public, which is in the end the same as private. So if we don't include private, we're losing the largest fraction of the actual charging. That means a smaller market is actually covered, and of course there will be less boost, less support for the EV industry as a whole. So I'll talk more about that later, but the scope is basically the supply side. So how many e-credits are supplied to the market? But it's only half of the picture, because it needs to be matched accordingly by the ambition level of the mechanism. Ambition level means how ambitious basically are the targets that each member state is setting. So what is the target percentage of renewable energy that should be delivered to road transport, or what are the CO2 emission reductions that should be achieved over time? So usually member states are defining certain targets over time. So they have targets for each year up to 2030, for example, and because this gives guidance to the market. And of course, if the targets are more ambitious, so higher percentage reductions, this means demand by the fossil fuel providers will be higher. Because in the end, it's a free market. It's defined by demand and by supply, which then determines the price. So whatever you change on the left-hand side, if you include a larger fraction of the market, this should also be followed by a higher ambition level on the right-hand side. It's not trivial to find the proper ambition level, because each country is different. Each country has a different electricity mix in its electricity market. Each country has a different EV uptake rate. So for some countries, what might be ambitious for some countries is clearly not for others, who are maybe further in their development into the EV transition, or have a electricity system which is already including lots of renewables. So therefore, I can only suggest policymakers to look for a good mix between the scope and the ambition level, because without a proper ambition level, prices will collapse, or it will not leave the level where it's not interesting for actual market participants to set up mechanisms to go for the operational effort to participate in the market. Now coming maybe back to the definition, to the decision on private charging and whether to include it or not. There are two, I would say, different cases of private charging. One is the actual charging at home that each individual person that owns an EV is probably doing, or at least most of them, because there it's really difficult to track how many kilowatt hours are charged. And therefore, at least Germany and Austria are working with a lump sum, so a fixed amount that is granted per year. In Germany, it's 2,000 kilowatt hours per year. In Austria, it's 1,500. Those are reasonable numbers. That's somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 kilometers per year, which I think is reasonable, especially since there is also, usually when you own a private car, there will also be public charging. So you only need to cover the fraction that is actually happening on charge points, which maybe have no backend, and it's difficult to track how many kilowatt hours are charged. But there are other cases which are still covered under private charging, but where it's way easier to track how many kilowatt hours are charged. For example, fleet operators, taxi services. So in general, more the commercial use cases. And in these cases, it's rather likely that you have a charge point management system in place that you can track how many kilowatt hours are actually charged. And what we suggest is that the actual kilowatt hours can sort of overrule the minimum lump sum level. So let's assume the lump sum level is at 1,500. Now, if you as owner of the electric vehicle can prove that you actually charged 2,500 on private chargers at your charger, then you'll get more money for it or more e-credits. That would be the system that I think also makes sense, and this is what was implemented in Austria. Now, in general, we think it makes sense to include private charging, of course, only if the ambition level follows accordingly, as mentioned. And why? Because most of the charging is actually happening in the private segment, so 85% of charging. If we also open this up to the private segment, this means the total cost of ownership for electric vehicles will decrease. So going back to the good times of 2022 in Germany, we were talking about 300 to 400 euros for an electric vehicle per year. This is a considerable amount, and this might also do the deal for some of the potential users of e-mobility. It will also support fleet electrification. We see that there is a problem that we cannot ramp up numbers fast enough. So this might be an additional support to an additional incentive to electrify fleets faster. It will also incentivize, of course, the deployment of private chargers, and in that regard also help member states to achieve the energy performance of buildings directive targets. So overall, I think it would be an easy way to further boost e-mobility, also because it's, of course, someone needs to pay. Those are then the mineral oil companies, but it is at least revenue neutral for governments. Of course, fiscal limits are always there. We cannot only go for subsidies, but this would be a mechanism that is revenue neutral, and it might make sense to extend this also to the private charging case. Another important aspect when setting up the mechanism is to define how e-credits are actually generated. Of course, this is happening via formulas that are predefined. And when setting this up, this is rather specific for the case where the scheme is set up in the way of GHG emission reductions, and not so much in the case of bringing in renewables. But when you want to bring down GHG emissions and you're basically rewarding e-mobility users to do that, what really matters is that we are not forgetting about the higher efficiency of electric drivetrains. We see that on the picture, on the right-hand side, where the petrol cars, so the left part of the right-hand side, you see that most of the primary energy that is going into these petrol cars is actually going into heating, is wasted. So only 20% of the primary energy is ending up is actually the energy that is providing the motion. And the picture is totally different when we go to electric cars because the drivetrain is way more efficient. Additionally, you can also use the energy that you're gaining back when braking, and the overall efficiency is way higher, above 80%. So here it says 89%, which is amazing. And if you would now only, so maybe a bit for context, e-credits are not the only way to fulfill RED requirements, but you can also bring in biofuels into the market. Now, if you would treat electricity same as biofuels, this would not be fair because e-mobility is just way more efficient and these drivetrains are more efficient. So with the same amount of energy going into the car, you can cover 4 times the distance, or at least 2.5 times, something like that. And therefore, we need to account for this also when defining how many credits are granted for e-mobility. So we suggest a correction factor for this efficiency of 0.4, which is then explaining the difference in efficiency and is creating a level playing field between technologies. The other important factor, and we provide, of course, the full formulas, at least for Germany and Austria, in the document. Another important factor is the multiplication factor. This is used to specifically foster and support certain technologies that you want to support. Some countries apply a factor of 3, some countries apply a factor of 4. We highly suggest to go for a factor of 4, especially if price levels are not as high as we wish for. For example, biofuels sometimes have a factor of 2. And what we need to create is a fair playing field. And we also want to support e-mobility further because it's required. And e-mobility is the key here to lower GHG emissions in the long run. So these 2 factors need to be decided upon, and we suggest a 4-time multiplier and a 0.4 correction factor for the efficiency.
So
handing over to Arthur.
Thank you, Moritz. Another key factor that will intervene in the formula is the actual quantity of energy that you can value. And here there are 2 main cases. Either the charging station or the charging point at home is directly plugged in to the grid, to the national grid. And in this case, if you are on a renewable scheme, what you can value in terms of credits is the share, only the renewable share of the energy that goes into the car. And so if you're plugged into the grid, that is basically the average over the past 2 years of renewable energy in the national mix of the given country. But as the directive planet, if you can show that you have a direct connection to a local source of renewable, mostly solar energy in general, then for each kilowatt hour that directly comes from the solar panel and goes into the car, you can get 100% of the credits. So that's 100% versus a renewable share that can be in some countries 30%, 25%, higher in Austria. But so you have a very big incentive to directly plug in the EV chargers to renewable sources. An interesting case study is the French case here, where on top of this nice bonus, you can even maximize the credits even more if you find good synergies between EV chargers, a solar panel, for example, and let's say a supermarket. If you optimize well the sizing of the solar plant, you will be able to basically reach hopefully close to 100% renewable energy, because the way the French scheme was designed is that the authorities will only look at what you supply back to the grid. And so if you really optimize your system locally to use the maximum of your renewable energy and use the synergies between the consumption of the supermarket and the consumption of the EV chargers, you can really optimize the e-credit. So that's, I think, a very nice scheme that could be extended in other countries in order to really incentivize not only green energy, but also local optimization of self-consumption in general. Now, going to, on the next slide, to another couple of key recommendations, in particular to avoid one main issue that we've seen in different markets, mostly in Germany, but it's coming into France too, which is very substantial price drops that we've observed, usually after something happened on the biofuels world market, for example. It can be linked to many other external factors. Electricity credits will be very sensitive to these external factors. And so we need, and member states need to find a way, without intervening too much on the market, obviously, to find a way to mitigate this risk and find a way to basically support a minimum or reasonable price indirectly. So we have three proposals here, 3 actions that member states can take in order to really avoid very substantial price drops. The first one, and that's very important, is to let operators get volumes continuously throughout the year to avoid a end of year or beginning of year bottleneck where everyone is selling at the same time, and so there's no power of negotiation. It is also important that member states find a way to automatically rise the targets. I think Moritz emphasized a lot on the importance of the level of ambition. If this level of ambition doesn't take into account what's happening on the market, then the objectives that were set will not be reached. So it's very important to automatically rise it if the price drops under a certain threshold. And in order to follow the price, that's also another proposal we have. We think a public index of the market could be useful. And the last point, last option, is that public authorities could consider setting a minimum mandate specific for electricity credits on obligated parties, as it is the case for some biofuels. Take the most advanced biofuels today. Obligated parties have a minimum percentage of incorporation. If you take the schemes where it's in percentage, a minimum percentage of advanced biofuels to have in their portfolio, either by directly including them at the pump or buying corresponding certificates. So this is doable, and this could be a good way for member states to sustain electricity credits at a reasonable price. Of course, the size of the mandate, how ambitious it is, should be adapted to the EV penetration rate in the given country.
Thank you both very much for this overview. As said, we just scratched the surface of all the recommendations, more of which you will find in the RED implementation guide. But these are the most important considerations to keep in mind for national authorities when setting up the credit mechanism and for the EV charging sector to better understand how to benefit from this solution that is now mandated by law. We are going to move into the Q&A part of the webinar. I see that there's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm very happy about that. Perhaps we will start with the one, what are the pros and cons of having energy targets versus emission reduction targets? So Moritz, or to whoever one of you would like to take the question.
I can take the question.
Go ahead.
So I think it mainly depends on the specific situation within each country. So for some countries, it makes sense to go for renewable targets, especially if the renewable sector is not that evolved and there should be an additional push for renewables. And it also depends on the rest of the electricity mix. So for example, is there a lot of coal in the market, or is there not so much coal in the market? So you cannot compare, for example, Germany and France. With France, a lot of nuclear energy in the market, which is not CO2 intense. So for France, it makes sense to more foster the renewables because there is not a lot of CO2 in the market anyway. For Germany, both of those mechanisms would work. So in the end, the question is rather, what does the specific country want to achieve with the regulation? And so it's a case by case, I would say. Arthur, maybe you want to add something here.
I was going to say the exact same thing. It's a matter of what you want to foster, more renewable or CO2. What is really important at the end of the day is the revenue in euro per kilowatt hour that this is generating and the impact on the end customer. So what's going to be very important is when member states switch from one scheme to the next, which will happen actually in France next year or maybe in 2026, switching from renewables to CO2-based scheme. It is then very important that the parameters are chosen so that the value of the tickets doesn't really change, that you sustain a similar incentive. But apart from that, yeah, I think it's what you said, Moritz, in terms of stakes.
Thank you. Another question we have is, how do aggregators operate? If we could dive a bit more into their function.
I can also take that one.
Go ahead.
So Aggregators are especially necessary in markets as Germany, when there is also a quota or an e-credit for the private segment, because there you will see that there are not only large CPOs that are active in the charging business, in the public charging business. For those, they can also organize the trading themselves. But for these small CPOs, only 1, 2, or 4 private charge points, for example, and the cars that need to be covered, then you basically need aggregators, because if we see that we have about 2 million BEV, for example, or 1.5, I'm not so sure, in the German market at the moment, and each single owner of an electric vehicle would then go to the authorities and would want to claim the e-credits, the operational effort would be huge. And therefore, there are aggregators who are then buying the credits from the end consumers, from the owners of the electric vehicles, aggregating those, and then also organizing the trading with the mineral oil companies. This is also necessary because there is market power, of course. The mineral oil companies, this is an oligopoly setup. And on the other hand, you would have super small counterparts that basically have no market power. So in order to create this level playing field, aggregators or traders are needed in order to achieve an efficient functioning of the market.
Thank you, Arthur. Would you like to add anything?
I would just maybe mention that I know that in some countries, in any case, there is a minimum volume that you need to reach to be able to trade. So for these cases, I think aggregators will be obviously needed. And yeah, I agree with the power of negotiation, the market power. This is very important. Obligated parties are usually looking for big volumes. They don't want to deal small volumes at a time. So definitely the importance of aggregators is clear.
Thank you. Another question we had was, why is there a need for the 4 times counting of electricity as well as the 0.4 factor? That was related to the formula slide, I suppose.
Yeah.
I can.
So okay. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I can take that one, but I'll let you add more comments after. The coefficient, the 3 or 4 coefficient, is really kind of political. It's really a choice in the hands of the government to push electricity credits with respect to other forms, other types of energy. If you take a very basic example, I mean, if we take Germany, I think the factor is 3 or 4. I don't remember exactly. 3, yeah, 3 in Germany.
Yeah, 3.
And Moritz told us earlier that the value of the credits have fallen to 3-4 cents of euros per kilowatt hours. So this is just a direct way to avoid having electricity tickets under 1 cent. And I think that's an important threshold. I think if when one day a market reach a price of under 1 cent of euro per kilowatt hour, it's really not worth it anymore for most of the players to do all the process to get their credits certified, because the impact on the final user price, we're talking, I mean, fast charging, for example, the average can be, let's say, 50 cents of euro per kilowatt hour for the end customer price. So if the price drops under 1 cent, this becomes totally negligible. So that, I think that's very important. And then it's a matter of tuning electricity versus hydrogen versus biofuels. It's really a choice of energy mix too, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And the 0.4 are basically really just there to account for the higher efficiency of e-mobility. So if you do the math, you'll see that then a correction factor of 0.4 creates this level playing field so that the actual impact is the same in emissions per kilometer covered, something like that.
Thank you. There was also a question on in cases where the CPO is not the owner of the charging point, who should receive the incentive for the traded e-credits, the CPO or the customer?
We argue that it should still be the CPO, because the CPO is the one who's still responsible for the charging infrastructure, also the one who knows how many kilowatt hours are charged, which for the functioning of the mechanism is the most important factor. Then of course there can be negotiations between the CPO and the owner of the area of the ground. But this should be left out of the mechanism itself. So of course the CPO can then negotiate with the owner or the other way around. But we still argue that it should be the CPO who should be the beneficiary of the e-credits.
Thank you. There are also a few questions about the guarantees of origin. So for example, there's a question saying that in Italy, the government has raised the issue of the double counting with funding that already subsidized the renewables. For example, the guarantees of origin, how would this be dealt with, this problem?
I would say guarantees of origin are an electricity market mechanism. So guarantees of origin are usually used to create a sort of side market for electricity. So electricity is a commodity, but if you want to specifically sell green electricity, you can emit these guarantees of origin and customers will be willing to pay for. That's the concept. But I would say this is a completely different market. And in my regard, it is not linked to what we do in the transport sector. Because one is electricity market based and the other is then transport sector based.
I would add that there would be maybe such a risk of double subsidy if basically the IPP, I mean the solar or wind producer had a way to basically benefit directly from e-credits, but provided that the e-credits are really directed to CPOs, I think there's no risk of this double counting problem. If you have on-site solar and EV charging, the CPO will benefit from the subsidies from the e-credit. The solar producer will benefit from guarantees of origin if they decide to sell it. And obviously, yeah, this will be totally a different scheme. So I don't think there's a real risk here.
Thank you. Maybe following up on the on the solar PVs. So when there's a local, let's say local solar PVs, is there a need to document the amount of local photovoltaic usage for the e-credits?
Yes, usually government asks for a proper meter that is directly linked to the solar panels.
Thank you.
In Germany, it even used to be the case that the charging infrastructure was not permitted to have a connection to the actual grid. So that was pretty strict. Meanwhile, at least you need to prove that the amount of kilowatt hours charged are coming directly from the PV installation. Yep.
Thank you. Another question is asking, how is the average annual consumption per electric vehicle calculated, so megawatts per year? Do you think it is better to establish a fixed value or the real annual consumption value of each EV?
I think we need to work with assumptions here because it's just unrealistic to have different values for each use case. And apart from that, I think it's calculated by taking a distance that is covered by each EV. On average, let's say 10,000 kilometers, and then you have a consumption of 15 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, and you end up at 1,500 kilowatt hours, for example. Numbers could be higher because then you need to deduct the share that is then happening in the public charging segment. But this is roundabout the calculation, and I think the numbers chosen in Austria, so the 1,500, and in Germany, 2,000, are both reasonable.
Thank you. A few more questions, perhaps following up on the question about the 4 times counting and the 0.4 factor, as I see it from the same person. So for the countries with the greenhouse gas emission-based policy, the emission factor then should be applied for the electricity. That's the question.
So the correction factor should for sure be applied. Yes.
Okay. All right. Just
so the 0.4, and again, this multiplication factor is a political decision on whether governments want to support e-mobility specifically, or rather biofuels. I would go for the former.
Yeah. And maybe one other question with regards to private charging. So how would you recommend to handle solar charging in a private use case, especially if net metering is used, considering that it is difficult to know how much a driver might charge from their solar panels versus energy from the grid?
I think that's difficult. And when we are talking about bringing in PV into e-credits, I think we're usually talking about public charging and not about the lump sum private charging use case. So I think technically and from a process point of view, it would be difficult to also account for private PV on rooftops at somebody at home in the e-credits. So for private charging, I think it's really difficult to account for PV.
Thank you. Artur, would you like to add anything? All right.
No, all good.
All right, I think I see one other question that I'll take. So to reach the red target, will all countries adopt the e-credit mechanism? So essentially, the Renewable Energy Directive is a directive, which means that each member needs to transpose it into its own national law. So it is not directly applicable. So what that means is that the directive gives sort of a mandate, and then each member state can decide how to implement it. So each member state must implement a credit mechanism that is part of their obligations in relation to the EU law. Now, how that will be done, we here are providing recommendations exactly that the member states we think should follow, and whether there are other things like tax or hard regulation, there could be, but coming from the Renewable Energy Directive, this will be an obligation for every member state. I see one other question came in. You mentioned that CPOs can sell their credits to fuel suppliers. Can they sell them to other buyers?
I don't think that there are other buyers. So we have the obligated parties, which are mineral oil companies. They need to prove that they brought in a certain fraction of renewables into transport, or that they lowered the CO2 intensity of what they brought into transport. And these obligated parties are those on the demand side of e-credits. So I think that's how the market works, and there are no other buyers for e-credits. Thank
you. I think those were all the questions that we would be able to answer today. If you have any follow-up questions, and we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll be able to hopefully help you. But thank you to everyone for participating in this webinar, and thanks a lot for your active participation with the Q&A, and also to our speakers for their presentations. So the webinar was helping to clarify the next steps ahead of the national implementation of the red credit mechanism for EV charging. It is now, of course, up to the member states to promptly and correctly implement this important tool in order to ramp up the deployment of the EV charging infrastructure and to enable the EV charging sector to continue building the needed infrastructure to support the EVs that are coming on the road. So as a reminder, you can find the implementation guide by scanning the QR code that you see on the screen. It is also available on our website, chargeupeurope.eu. As I said, for your convenience, it is available in every European language. If you have any questions, any further questions after today's webinar, you are invited to contact us at the secretariat at chargeupeurope.eu, and we will do our best to help you. So thank you once again to everyone for your time and for being here with us today, and wish you all a great sunny day and hopefully great summer holidays in the coming weeks.